Okay, we're going to start Chapter 17. This is the first lecture explanation video for Chapter 17, and it's what it's entitled is Activity-Based Costing. Now, as a prelude to this discussion, I must say that Chapter 17 is considered by some to be probably the toughest chapter that we're going to cover in this course. We're going to cover 11 chapters, and a lot of students feel that this is probably the toughest one just because there's so many numbers jumping around, and it becomes somewhat detailed, because what we're trying to do in this chapter is to get a better costing model for in dealing with factory overhead. And I know that probably doesn't make any sense at this point. But what we're going to be dealing with is this. We know that in a manufacturing environment, whether we're talking about job order costing, where we're calculating the cost by job, accumulating costs by job, or process costing, where we are accumulating costs for a period of time and then allocating those costs for this period of time, for a month, to the costs that were, to the units that were completed and the ones that were still here. So we're either calculating the cost of a job that we worked on, various jobs we worked on, or we're calculating the cost of things that we finished and transferred off to another department. But either way, we have to track the direct materials, the direct labor, and the factory overhead that's charged to either those jobs or those processes. So recall it looked like this. The costs in a manufacturing environment, whether it's job order costing or process costing, we have our three inventories: raw materials, work in process, and finished goods. We accumulate our factory overhead in the factory overhead account. And whether we're talking about, like I said, job order costing or process costing, whether this work in process account is represented by various jobs or it's by a process where we're going to accumulate the costs and deal with them all at the end of the month, whatever it is, we're accumulating costs, direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. Now, it might be easier to, well, I guess it wouldn't be. Now, with these three product costs, as you recall, direct materials is a hard cost, which means that I'm tracing that cost. I can verify that that was the cost that this department used or this job used this month. That was the cost of direct materials, and that comes from material requisition slips. I can trace those costs directly to this cost object, whether it's a job or a process. Direct labor, same thing. That is a hard cost. It is a traceable cost. I can show that that is what this job or this process cost for direct labor. But factory overhead is not a direct cost. Remember that by definition, factory overhead is all these indirect costs, which is why I accumulate them all in the factory overhead account, and then I allocate them or apply them, applied to either jobs or to processes, usually based on a percentage, based on an overhead rate, which is tied to labor. So this is not a hard cost. This is an estimated cost that I'm just dipping into the total indirect costs of the factory and charging it to jobs or processes based on some factor that will gauge the size of the job or process. Usually it's based on direct labor. Now that's what we were learning. That's what we looked at. So when I have a particular job, I start the job. I know we're going to have direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. I'm going to keep track of the direct materials that are actually consumed to produce this job. I'm going to look at the time cards and see how much direct labor cost on this particular job. But then I'm going to splash it or allocate some factory overhead to it based on its direct labor. And for the most part, that's okay, because factory overhead is an indirect cost anyway. So as long as I splash it to, as long as I splash a large amount to big jobs and a little amount to small jobs, we should be okay. But the world is a little bit more complex than that. And before we get into how we're going to solve the problem, I want to demonstrate the problem. I want to show what the problem actually is by just working by way of an example. So I'm going to start off with a brand new example and just sit back and see if you can absorb these numbers. You may have to watch this a couple times, but after you've seen it a couple times, it'll start to make sense. So here's what we've got. We've got a factory, and we produce wine, and that's what in my example, that's what we're producing. We're producing wines. We're producing red wines and white wines. So here's what my factory looks like. Physically, here's what my factory looks like. It's got a door. It's got a door at both ends. Okay. So what it is that, and I'm going to try to keep this kind of simplistic, is that we have raw materials which come in the form of grapes. I guess that's what you make wines with, right? Grapes and bottles and corks and labels. I guess those are all those would be all considered raw materials that going into a bottle of wine, right? And so what it does is that they're brought in the back of my factory, and then they're processed. Whatever we do to them, we stomp them, we squeeze the grapes, we add sugar, we cook it. I'm not sure how wine is actually made. I'm on the other end. I'm in consumption rather than production of wine. I'm just looking for my eraser here. Okay. Now these these are the guys that are working on the production line here. I want to make this a straight line. Here's the production line, and we've got guys that are working. This is the direct labor. This is who they are. They're actually making bottles of wine. Now, normally what we do is we have we are making two types of wine. We're making white wine and red wine. We're making Chardonnays and Merlots. So my production every year, in white wines, we make 60,000 bottles. I don't know if you can see that up. Yeah, 60,000 bottles. And the red wines, we make 40,000 bottles. So every year we have a grand total of 100,000 bottles of wine. Now the production process works like this. We bring in grapes and we make wines, and the white wines, I'm going to use the white, because white won't show up on white. I'm going to use blue for white and red for red. So what we do is that when the white wines come in, we stomp the grapes and we do whatever it needs to do and we bottle them. But as far as I know, I don't think white wines need to age very much. You can go to a store and get a 2019 Chardonnay or a 2018 Chardonnay. I don't think you'd want to drink a 2010 Chardonnay. White wines, I believe, don't really have an aging process. So when they get through this process, they're sent out and they're sent to the store right away. That's 60,000 bottles. Now, red wines, when the grapes come in, we do the same thing. We stomp the grapes and we bottle it. We put the labels on, but we want to age those a little bit. So what happens with red wines is that they actually go over to this storage, and this is where the storage is. And we're going to store these red wines for a few years, and this is where all the red wines are all stored. And after a few years, when they're all done, Then we send those out to the stores, and we maybe send out 40,000 bottles, but not the 40,000 I made this year, maybe the 40,000 I made 5 years ago. And then I bring 40,000 in and I take 40,000 out. So really that's the process. We've got grapes coming in, we're making white wines and they're heading out the door right away. We're making red wines and they're heading out the door right away. So now we want to figure out how much to sell our wines for. How much should we actually sell them for? So let's take a look here. Probably the best determination of what to sell wines for is, well, what did they cost to make? We've got our white wines and our red wines. And I want to know, what does it cost to make one bottle of wine? One bottle. Well, remember, we're making 60,000 bottles of red. I'm sorry, 60,000 bottles of white, 40,000 bottles of red, and each one is going to have direct materials, direct labor cost, and it's going to have factory overhead applied to it. So what I want to know is, what does it cost to make a bottle of wine? So let's start with materials. Now, materials, recall, are a hard cost. I can determine what the grapes cost that go into a production batch or into a particular job, the bottle cost and everything. And I'm going to say that the direct material cost for one bottle of white is $1, and for one bottle of red is $1. They both take about the same amount of grapes. Grapes run about the same, whether we're talking about Flames or Thompsons. Thompsons for white, Flames for red. Bottles cost about the same, labels cost the same, corks cost the same. They all take $1 of direct materials. Now, direct labor. Here's our direct labor guys. These are the guys that are crushing the grapes and cooking them, stomping them, and bottling them up. And what we're going to see here is that what we're paying these guys is direct labor cost is $15 per hour, regardless of what they're working on, because it takes just as much time to crush a white wine as it does a red wine. It takes as much time to bottle it, takes as much time to squeeze that cork in there. And I'm going to say that it takes 1 hour. Actually takes, we are going to spend 100,000 direct labor hours to produce those 100,000 bottles. So that's an hour. It takes 1 hour to produce each bottle. It takes 1 hour to actually stomp and bottle a white. It takes 1 hour to stomp and bottle a grape. So that's $15 of labor in each one. So far they have the same cost, don't they? Same amount of grapes, same bottle, same label cost, same amount of time taken to do this. But factory overhead now. Well, factory overhead, we need to come up with that predetermined rate that we talked about. So I want to know what are all the indirect costs associated with this factory. What's the rent of the factory? It's going to be the costs of everything except the raw materials and the direct labor. Rent, utilities, property taxes, maintenance, indirect labor, janitors, the guy driving the forklift. It's going to be the paper towels in the kitchen, all the indirect costs of running this factory, every other cost. And the total factory overhead is $1 million per year. That's the total factory overhead. So we need to come up with a rate. Now, this is called the traditional rate, because this is what everybody used. It was traditional, sometimes called the plant-wide rate. Traditional rate, plant-wide. We're going to come up with one rate, just one rate. And you remember what that is? The rate is, and I'm going to do it, just say this, I'm going to say it comes out to be, it's the same thing. Traditional or plant-wide rate is taking the factory overhead, the $1 million, And I'm gonna base it based on not on direct labor dollars, but maybe on bottles. Let's do it based on bottles. We can do that. No, I'm sorry. We should do it based on direct labor hours, which is 100,000 hours. Yeah. So we're going to spread this $1 million of factory overhead. Remember what the factory overhead rate is. It's your estimated factory overhead divided by some basis, and we used factory labor costs before, but I'm going to use the direct labor hours. 100,000 direct labor hours. Still tied to labor. That's $10 per direct labor hour. Now, the key behind this traditional or plant-wide rate is that there's just one rate. We're using one rate plant-wide. And this was the traditional. This was the first method, and this is what everybody used, $10 per direct labor hour. Now, let's charge off to one bottle of wine. We determined that the factory overhead spread over 100,000 direct labor hours, that every bottle should be charged $10 for every direct labor hour it has. Well, whites, how many direct labor hours did it have? 1. So we'll charge it $10 of factory overhead. And how many direct labor hours does a bottle of red have? 1. They both take an hour of direct labor to produce. So here now we've got a cost then of materials, labor, and overhead of $26 for a white and $26 for a red. So maybe what we'll do is we'll charge, okay, how much should we charge then so we make money on it? Well, maybe for a sales price, and I'm just going to put sales price here, we'll say sales price, let's charge $30 each. They both cost the same amount, so let's charge $30 each. So we make $4 per bottle. Does that make sense so far? And so far it did under the traditional method that each bottle takes the same amount of materials, takes the same amount of time, and because the factory overhead is being charged to my two products based on direct labor time, they take the same amount of time, so they get charged the same factory overhead. So we came out with the same cost. So we've determined that we should be making $4 on a bottle of white and $4 on a bottle of red. But the phenomena that would take place here is that we would find that the reds would be selling quickly, but nobody would be buying the whites. The whites, because my competitors are selling the whites for, say, $20, and they're selling their reds for, we'll say, $40. Yeah, reds, and I think generally, I mean, with some exception, I think reds cost a little bit more than whites. Why is that? Well, some of you see it already, I'm sure, and it's because of this. Stepping back to the big picture, look at this big picture here. Does it really cost as much to make a white as it does to make a red? Does it really? And the answer is no. For all intents and purposes, white wines are cheaper to make because the materials come in, they come down the conveyor belt, and then they head out the door. And they're gone. But how about reds? Reds have to come into this area and sit for a few years. Does that cost me money to maintain this storage area to age the red wines? And the answer is yes, it does. Absolutely it does. So the traditional plant-wide rate, the one rate that is allocating the entire factory overhead of my production facility, is not taking into account that some products, like the red wines, are utilizing more of the facility than others. Some products don't consume a lot of the overhead or the factory. They're in and they're out and they're gone, but the other ones that have to sit here and be worked on or aged, that they cost more because they have to spend longer here. And that length of time that they're spending here is not reflected in the direct labor hours. They both take the same amount of direct labor, but I think you would agree that this area, this storage area, whatever the costs of this storage area are, those should be allocated only to the red wines, just to the reds, not to the whites. So that's where ABC costing came in. It's either what we call either departmental costing or ABC costing. They work exactly the same way, whether we're talking about departments or activities. And I'm going to talk about maybe just departments. We'll do it in departments because that's easier to understand right now. Is to say, wow, this traditional, that's not working the way I thought it would. So I'm going to use a little different color. Maybe I'll use the black here, darker color, to say, let's refigure the cost of our whites and our reds using departmental costing or ABC costing. And ABC stands for activity-based costing. Costing based on how much our products are utilizing the activities in this business. And our activities are actually our departments. So we want to break down, we want to recognize that our production facility is actually made up of two departments or two activities. There's production, and then there's storage. We have two activities, so I want to come up with a rate for each activity. So if I have two activities or two departments, I'm going to have two factory overhead rates. So what I want to do is number one, I want to identify my activities, and I identified two of them. Here's one, and here's two. There's one department, there's a second department. Now, I have to allocate this $1 million. I have to sit down and figure out, of this $1 million, how much of it is really associated with this, and how much of it, the $1 million, is associated with the storage. And that's going to take some time probably. The activity-based costing is kind of time-consuming, but we're going to get a better costing model. But it is a little time-consuming. I have to take every single one of the costs that make up this $1 million and say, okay, well, how would I allocate it between the two? Well, let's start with rent. However much of this $1 million is rent, I think I would allocate the rent maybe based on square footage. It looks like about 80% of it is this storage, and the 20% is over here in production. That's cool. Utilities, probably about the same. About 80% storage, 20% production. How about paper towels in the employee lunchroom? Well, maybe I'll do it based on the relative number of employees on the production line based on the relative number of employees in storage. Probably not too many employees over here. If I have 99 employees working over here and one just walking around making sure there's no leaks, well, I'd say 99% of the employee costs of the employee break room are being utilized by these employees because there's 99 out of 100 employees work there. So anyway, we'll get to that, but we just need to allocate this $1 million between the two identified departments. And in my case, I'm just going to say, well, this $1 million, 200,000 is allocated to the production department, and the other 800,000 is allocated to storage. Okay, so I'm going to come up with two rates using the same formula, estimated overhead divided by some basis. So let's start with production. The estimated factory overhead of the production department is 200,000. And I think direct labor hours is a good basis for allocating that 200,000 among the wines based on the number of labor hours. That's $20 per direct labor hour. Now how about the storage? Well, that's 800,000. The estimated factory overhead there is 800,000. Notice we're using the same formula, dividing overhead by some factor. And in this case, I think I wouldn't use direct labor because there's no direct labor in storage. I think I'd use number of bottles. How many bottles do we have in here? or how many bottles are coming in here? 40,000 are coming in here. That's $2 per. Is that $2 or $20? That's $20 per bottle. I'm sorry, and this is $2 per direct labor hour. My mistake. $2 per direct labor hour and $20 per bottle. Now, let's recost these wines using not this, but activity-based costing, which has two rates, one for production, one for storage. No effect on direct materials, that's a hard cost. No effect on direct labor, that's a hard cost. But let's start with the factory overhead for production. How are we charging the whites and the red wines for production? We're charging at the rate of $2 per direct labor hour. How many direct labor hours does the white have? 1. So it'll get charged $2 of the production side's factory overhead. And how about the red wines? Well, it also has 1 hour of direct labor, so we're going to charge it $2 for the production department's factory overhead. Same amount, because they both have the same amount of time. Now storage, we're charging that at $20 per bottle. Whites don't go to storage, so they don't have any. But reds, $20 per bottle. So that's going to change our cost now to, I believe it drops this to $18 and takes this up to 16 plus 22, $38. Do I have that correct? Let's see here. Yeah, and 18. Yeah, so, oh, well, no wonder we're losing money. We should drop this to maybe $20 per bottle, so we're making a little bit of money there, and take this up to $40 per bottle. So we're making a little bit of money there. Now, the whole point of this example was just to show this, that even though we are making two different products and they take the same amount of time to make, perhaps one traditional overhead rate, just a plant-wide rate, isn't refined enough to take into account that some products actually consume more of the factory than other products. And if we've got a product that consumes more of the factory or more of the departments than other products, maybe the way we charge the factory overhead, maybe we shouldn't do it by the entire plant, but maybe we should do it by individual departments or factories to get a better costing method. And that's exactly what we're going to do. That's exactly what we're going to do. To give you another example, now many companies don't produce just one product. That's being pretty risky. A company that just produces one product and that's it, what happens if the demand for that product goes away? Well, then that company's out of business. But a company that is like a conglomerate and produces 40 different products, if one goes away, well, they're still in business. They'll still stay afloat. So they produce many different products, and so they have many different departments, various departments. So I may have a production facility here that maybe makes, and I'll keep this kind of simple. I'll say we make cookies. Remember our example in the last chapter? We were actually making cookies, and we have 3 departments. I'm going to say we have 3 departments. Okay. Raw materials come in. We have the mixing department. We have the baking department. Then we have the frosting department. Now, let's say chocolate chip cookies. Chocolate chip cookies, and that's what's black. What process is the chocolate chip cookie going to go through our department? It's going to go like this. It's going to start in mixing, then it's going to go to baking, but is it going to go to frosting? And the answer is no. Then it's done and it's out. But how about frosted sugar cookies? They're going to come into mixing, they're going to go to baking, they're going to go to frosting, and then they're going to go out. So will one plant-wide rate, if we just say one plant-wide rate based on direct labor, which is in mixing, takes the same amount of time to mix a chocolate chip cookie as it does a sugar cookie. Takes the exact same amount of time. So if we allocate the factory overhead of this entire cookie making plant to all the cookies based on direct labor, which is really tied to mixing, that means that a chocolate chip cookie is going to get charged the same amount of labor as a frosted cookie. But should it? And the answer is no, because the chocolate chip cookies do not utilize this department or this activity, frosting. So it is probably, notwithstanding the fact that the ingredients might be a little bit more, if the ingredients are the same cost and taking the same amount of time to bake, a chocolate chip cookie is probably cheaper to make than a frosted sugar cookie, because a frosted sugar cookie has to be frosted, has to spend a little bit more time in here. It's actually a little bit more burdensome on the factory. So that's the whole idea behind departmental or activity-based costing, is we want to break our factory into departments or activities and charge products accordingly. So we've got a factory here that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've made six different departments, and maybe we have one product that we start, and it comes in here and it goes through here, and then it's gone. So it only utilizes 3 departments. So should it be charged some of the factory overhead attributable to these other 3? The answer is no, it should not. We may have another product that comes in and it goes through these, and then it's gone. So it utilizes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 departments. Maybe it's a more complex product, and so it should be charged a proportionate amount of these 5 departments, but not this one. How about if we have another one that just comes in and goes out? Very simple. It's a very simple product. We buy it and package it and sell it. So it should be charged just it gets charged its materials and its labor, of course. But what about factory overhead? Should it be charged with a proportionate amount of all 7 departments? The answer is no. And by using what's called the traditional or plant-wide rate, traditional or plant-wide, is one rate for the entire department. And so if we use just one rate, we're charging every product with a proportion of every department. ABC costing, though, on the other hand, ABC costing has multiple rates. So that's why it's a little bit more confusing, is that we just have more rates to deal with. So in this case, if I identified 6 different departments, I'm going to have 6 different rates. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the blue one, it's going to get charged 3 of those, whatever department it goes through, and I'm going to call this number, we'll call this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, whatever this blue product is, it's going to get charged some of number 1, some of number 5, and some of number 6, but not 2, 3, and 4 because it doesn't utilize that. The red one's going to goes through everything except 2. So it's going to have more overhead charged to it because it's utilizing more of the factory. The green one will only be charged some of the overhead of 3, and that's it. So that's how we're going to cost products, is that prior to this year just beginning, now remember a factory overhead rate, the traditional factory overhead rate, it's computed before the year even begins. We're going to come up with one rate before the year even starts that represents the entire factory. ABC costing says I'm just going to come up with, in this example, 6 rates before the year even starts. And when a product is done, I'm going to say, well, how much of this department did it use? How much of this department? How much of this department? And charge it a proportionate amount of that factory overhead based on what it utilizes. Now, that's the theory behind this chapter, is that we're really focusing in on this. This chapter is focusing in on this right here. Is focusing in how I'm going to charge factory overhead to jobs or to processes, but I'm going to do it multiple times, not just one time, but multiple times, one for each department or one for each activity, depending on how I'm going to break up my factory. So that's what we're going to do. So with that, I'm going to cut this video right here. That's what we're going to be doing in this chapter. So now the next video that I'll load you probably tomorrow or the next day is I'm going to work out the example that's in the text. The textbook has a running example of how it's going to work. They do it first based on traditional, then they do it based on departmental. And so I want to work through that using their numbers. And then we'll continue on from there. So don't try to learn this all in one night. It's going to take a little bit of time for this to absorb. But hopefully I've just laid the foundation to show that in a manufacturing environment that has very different products that spend very different amounts of time and go through very different paths throughout my production facility, I want the cost to reflect that path or that amount of time that it's spending here. Products that are more burdensome on the factory should get more factory overhead regardless of how much labor it took to make it. So with that, maybe start reading just the first 3 pages and look for the next video.